Let's get going. The question is as follows. Madame Fry, appuyez par
Ms. Fry, seconded by Mr. Arya, moved that Bill S-209, an act respecting Pandemic Observance Day, be now read a third time and do pass.
Members voting electronically has started in the House. Will now proceed with the vote. Will all those at my right in favor of the motion please rise? In the
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Mr. Chahal.
Mr. Chahal.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Henley.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
fifth row.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morrissey.
Miss Sidhu Brampton South.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Miss Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Miss Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Fourth row.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Miss May Sanos Gulf Islands.
Ms. May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Troisième rangée.
Third row.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Fredriscatos.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row.
Scrow.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Miss Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Mendocino.
Mr. Mendocino.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
First row at my right.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Mr. Guilbeault.
Miss Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Miss Chager.
Ms. Chager.
All those at my left in favor of the motion will please rise. In the sixth row.
Don't do it, Jamel.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Mr. Blanchet-Jonca.
Madame Birubé.
Madame Berube.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Cinquième rangée à ma gauche.
Fifth row.
Gagné.
Madame Sinclair de Gagné.
Miss Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Fourth row.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux.
Miss Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Troisième rangée.
Third row.
Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row.
De Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. John.
Miss McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
First row.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Now, all those at my right opposed to the motion will, opposed to the motion will please rise. In the sixth row, in the fifth row, quatrième row.
Fourth row. Third row. Second row. First row.
All those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise. In the sixth row.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Fass.
Mr. Fass.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Cinquième rangée.
Fifth row.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Falk Battlefords Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Fourth row at my left.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicop.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Pupta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Miss Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Mr. Generu.
Mr. Generu.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Third row.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row.
Ellie.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Miss Finley.
Miss Finley.
Mrs. Cousy.
Mrs. Cousy.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Premier rangée.
First row.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Shear.
Mr. Shear.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Miss Lois Holloman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Holloman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
La Chambre est maintenant la fête.
The House We'll now wait for the electronic voting.
Wish to inform the House the electronic voting period has ended. If members were unable to vote due to technical difficulties, the chair will recognize them. We'll start online first. Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, I vote yea.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga, yea. Poole.
Ms. Thomas.
Vote no.
Mrs. Thomas, nay, contre.
Ms. Rempel-Garner.
I vote no.
Ms. Rempel-Garner, nay, contre.
We have two in the chamber, I believe. Mr. Champagne.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't manage to vote electronically, but I'd like to have my vote recorded. Mr. Champagne, aye.
My app didn't work. I'd like to vote yay. Thank you.
Mr. Housefather, yay, pour.
Sometimes it's the effort that counts. Le Bureau va maintenant compiler les résultats.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 198, 198. Nays contre 115, 115.
I declare the motion carried. Daily routine of business, affaire courant ordinaire, dépôt de documents.
Tabling of documents.
Introduction of government bills. It being 6:14, the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper. Oh, I have a point of order from the Honourable Member for Waterloo.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to submit a membership report for some membership changes that all parties have agreed to.
Oppose the Honourable Member. Moving the motion, please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion, please say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Waterloo.
Pursuant to Standing Order 104 and 114, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 64th report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs regarding the membership of committees of the House. And I would like to ask that the House give its consent so that I can move concurrence in the 64th report later, well now.
All those opposed to the Honourable Member moving the motion, please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion, please say nay. Motion is carried. Any Honourable Member for Waterloo? We're good? All right, we're good. Orders of the day. Oh yeah, well. Or how about I just read this? Private members' business. While we're figuring this one out, the Honourable House Leader for the NDP.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would hope that we would have unanimous consent for a motion to return to petitions and to have a brief period for the presentation of petitions before going to PMB.
Okay, well, normally the idea was at 5:30 we normally interrupt business to go to PMB hour, and that's kind of what we're under the assumption are. But I would suggest that we would either stick that, but the Honourable Member did move a motion, so all those opposed to the Honourable Member moving the motion that we do petitions will please say nay. I'm hearing a number of nays. So I'll just, there you go, orders of the day.
Orders of the day. Affaire émanant des députés, private business. Consideration at second reading of Bill C-381, an act to amend the Criminal Code, extortions. Bill standing in the name of Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal, seconded by Mr. Soroka, moves that Bill C-381, an act to amend the Criminal Code, extortion, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Debate. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, crime is wreaking havoc in our neighborhoods and communities right across this country. We see extraordinary crime statistics in almost every single category. And we continue hearing of incidences which are committed by the same repeat offenders who get arrested, get released, commit more crimes, and the cycle repeats. This is a result of the last 9 years of the Liberals' soft-on-crime policies. After 9 years under this Prime Minister, our nation faces a full-blown crisis that demands urgent action. Each day, Canadians wake up to the news of more gun violence, gang shootings, extortion, auto theft, robberies, and arson. This wasn't the case 9 years ago. So what happened 9 years ago, Mr. Speaker? Canadians got a new Prime Minister. A Prime Minister whose soft-on-crime policies unleashed chaos in our once peaceful towns and suburbs. A Prime Minister who made Canada a safe haven for organized crime and gangs. A Prime Minister who makes life easier for criminals, not Canadians, with his broken catch-and-release bail system. According to the Liberal government's own news release, auto theft in Toronto has skyrocketed by an alarming 300% since 2015. In just 9 years, there has been a terrifying increase in extortion across the country. In fact, the rate of extortion was 5 times higher in 2022 than a decade prior. In 2022, the rate of police reported extortion has increased for the 3rd consecutive year. Extortions have skyrocketed in Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia, where it has risen 263%, 284%, and 386% respectively since 2015. Wow. These numbers are extremely alarming, Mr. Speaker. In the GTA alone, extortions have increased by 155% since 2015, and in Vancouver, 228%. Wow. I would like to remind my colleagues and the House that behind every number and every statistic, there's a real family and a business owner who fear for their safety and their family's well-being. Canadians' lives and livelihoods are at stake, Mr. Speaker. There are examples of terrified families right across the country. I met one such family in the GTA who run a very successful Canadian business. They worked hard to get where they are today. But earlier this year, they received these extortion threats. Soon after the threat, their house was shot at. The family had to stay separately in different hotels. They wore bulletproof vests to go outside, and they had to purchase a bulletproof vehicle. And other long list of security measures, all because they run a successful business. Mr. Speaker, I also want to tell you about Mr. Butta Singh Gill. He moved to Edmonton from Punjab, where he was a trained lawyer. Like many new Canadians, he worked in a meat plant when he got to Edmonton, then went on to drive a bus for the Edmonton Transit System. And then he followed up on his dream to become an entrepreneur. And he started building homes, first starting with single-family homes, then multi-family homes, and eventually building apartments for Canadians to live in. He also gave back to the community. In fact, he was heavily involved, him and his family, in revitalizing one of the gurdwaras in Edmonton. His family also received extortion threats like this. They shot at his family home. They burnt down houses that he had under construction. So they also had to take extraordinary security measures. Obviously extremely expensive for any family or business to undertake. But Butta would not let these thugs slow him down. Mr. Speaker, last week, Mr. Butta Singh Gill, a prominent Edmonton businessman, a family man, just welcomed his first grandkids, two twins, and community leader, was murdered in broad daylight at one of his construction sites. Now, it seems that the murder has nothing to do with the extortion letters, but regardless, he is another tragic victim of violent crime in our country. I went to his family home, met with his family. His sister-in-law and brother said that they can't believe that this is happening in Canada, that they moved to Canada for a better life for their family, a safer life for their family. And they're right. This isn't the Canada that they moved to. Things have been very different in the last 9 years. Mayors in British Columbia and Ontario have written to the Prime Minister's top government officials asking them to take concrete action to combat extortion in their once peaceful communities. Despite this, we continue to see the government's complete inaction. Mr. Speaker, extortion is a federal problem. The criminal code that allows these criminals to openly operate freely is federal. The RCMP, which is responsible for catching these criminals, is also federal. And yet, our neighborhoods are grappling with the reality of this Prime Minister's indifference to their suffering. Our law enforcement continues to catch and release the same individuals who terrorize our communities and continue to commit crimes because of soft-on-crime Liberal policies. And of course, Mr. Speaker, it's not just extortion. Auto theft continues to rise across Canada. Statistics Canada paints a grim picture with auto theft up by 190% in Moncton, 122% in the Ottawa-Gatineau area, over 100% in Montreal, and 62% in Winnipeg. These staggering statistics underscore the urgent need for action to address this growing threat to our communities. In 2022, the insurance industry spent over $1 billion in car theft. Now, where does that extra $1 billion come from? It comes from the pockets of hardworking Canadians paying the cost of auto theft crime. With insurance premiums skyrocketing, some Canadian drivers are facing a staggering 25% increase in premiums this year alone. And again, the responsibility to combat auto theft lies squarely with the federal government. In fact, all primary prevention tools, such as the criminal code, the RCMP, the CBSA, and our port systems, are at this Prime Minister's disposal. Liberal catch and release soft-on-crime policies, Bill C-75 and C-5, have allowed crime to thrive in our country. Liberal Bill C-5 eliminated mandatory prison time for drug traffickers and those who commit acts of violence. It allows criminals of violent acts to serve their sentences at home, Mr. Speaker, in the same communities that they've terrorized. According to a recent report published by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, violent crime is only getting worse, and in Canada's violent crime index severity is at its highest level since 2007. This means that the overall severity of crime has risen significantly in Canada. To put things in perspective, under the previous Conservative government, the violent crime severity index decreased by almost 25%. Under the Liberal government, it has increased by 30%. According to Statistics Canada, the rate of firearm-related violent crime in 2022 was at the highest level ever recorded. This is a 9% increase from 2021 alone. Because of Liberal catch-and-release policies, criminals who get caught are able to walk away and are back on our streets, terrorizing a neighborhood sometimes within hours. Just talk to a local police officer and he'll tell you that. In addition, an increasing number of criminal cases are being stayed or withdrawn thanks to this Liberal Justice Minister who has simply failed to appoint enough judges. What does this government have to say to the victims of these crimes? Or to our hard-working police officers who are sick and tired of catching the same criminals over and over again? Not surprisingly, Canadians are losing faith in our justice system. After 8 years of Liberal catch-and-release policies, letting crime and chaos run rampant on our streets, only 46% of Canadians still have confidence in our justice system. For Conservatives, combating crime is a top priority. What we want to tell Canadians today is that you don't have to live like this. Conservatives have a common sense plan to protect our businesses and neighborhoods with common sense legislation that prioritizes the safety of Canadians. My private member's bill, the Protection Against Extortion Act, Bill C-381, is a common sense bill which addresses extortion and those who terrorize our communities with demands for protection money. First and foremost, this bill will undo the serious damage caused by this government's reckless crime policies, such as Bill C-5. Bill C-5 eliminated mandatory jail time for committing extortion with a firearm. On top of this, the government also brought in catch and release bail policies in Bill C-75, which makes it easier for extortionists to get back onto our streets. Bill C-381 will establish a mandatory prison sentence of 3 years after a criminal conviction of extortion. In addition, we will bring in a mandatory 5-year prison sentence for any criminal convicted of extortion who is acting on behalf of a gang or organized crime. Not only does this mean that the criminals who carry out these crimes will go to prison, but also means that prosecutors and police will have another tool to go after ringleaders of these organized crimes. We will restore mandatory 4-year prison sentences for the offense of extortion with a firearm. We will make arson an aggravating factor. And finally, we reverse the damage done by Bill C-75 and restore jail, not bail, for repeat offenders. Conservative Bill C-381 ensures that extortion crime means mandatory jail time. It will go after the criminals, their gang leaders, and anyone who participates in threatening our community members with arson or violence. With Bill C-381, common sense conservatives send a clear message to criminals and their organized criminal bosses. If you do the crime, you will do the time. My colleagues and I will not tolerate the exploitation of our citizens for financial gain, and we will not allow organized crime rings to terrorize our communities. Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserve safe streets and secure communities. They deserve a government that will listen to them and take their safety concerns seriously. It is our duty to deliver on this fundamental promise. Common sense conservatives will fix the damage and the chaos that this government's 9 years in power has created. We will ensure that extortionists who scare and intimidate our neighbors stay longer in jail. We will go after the leaders of these organized crime rings to make sure they get shut down once and for all. Extortion has no place in Canada. Conservatives will bring home safe streets for all Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Let's bring it home.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Surrey Newton.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend the Honourable Member from Edmonton Millwoods for bringing this bill forward. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to extortions, BC is also one of the provinces that he mentioned. In fact, Mr. Speaker, all orders of the government, irrespective what the political stripe is, and all the police forces in Canada have to come together to find a smart and tough solution to deal with these situations. Just wondered if the Honourable Member will agree that we, not only as one party, but in fact, irrespective what the political stripe is, and all orders of the government and all the police forces have to come together to find a smart and tough solution to deal with this situation.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, it's nice to say that we all need to come together and find a solution, but the fact is that member is a part of this government that brought in Bill C-75 and C-5, which makes it easier for violent criminals to get back out onto the streets and terrorize the same communities that they come from. If you talk to police officers right across the country, they will tell you that they are arresting criminals in the morning and they're being released by later that day. That member and that government had the power to keep criminals in jail. They chose their ideological ways, soft on crime policies, and allowing these criminals back on the streets. Mr. Speaker, only conservatives will put criminals behind bars, jail, not bail.
That's exactly right.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Souk. I'm gonna get mixed up every time here to make sure.
Alphabetical. Esquimalt, Sanik, Souk.
Esquimalt, Sanik, Souk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, we have Conservatives bringing forward a bill that calls for imposing mandatory minimum penalties. And I'm wondering what evidence they have in describing this as a tool that mandatory minimums actually work as a deterrent. Because as a former criminal justice instructor, I can cite you stacks of information that show that mandatory minimums have absolutely no deterrent effect.
The honourable member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that since this government has been in power in the last 9 years, and they brought in policies that NDP member and the NDP and Liberal government have brought in, these soft on crime policies, crime has gone up. Every statistic across the country with violent crime has gone up. We have made a commitment to Canadians that we will put these criminals behind bars. And Mr. Speaker, a repeat violent offender who's behind bars cannot go out and commit crimes again because they're in jail.
Exactly.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank and commend my colleague and the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party for his leadership on prioritizing victims, not offenders, but prioritizing victims. I'm wondering if he could share about how the scales need to be tipped back to ensure that it's victims and their rights that are protected at a time when we see crime running rampant on the streets of this country.
The honourable member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for this question. And he's right. We have to take the side of victims right across the country. I continue to meet with so many victims and who are just lost for words. They're what can they do to protect their families? Many of them are new Canadians who came to this country expecting a better future. And they feel that they can't do anything. Many of them, those that their vehicles are being stolen, nothing that they can do. Those that have been involved in violent crime, nothing they can do. They actually see the same person who committed those crimes back out on the streets, Mr. Speaker. Canadians feel helpless. Canadians need help. Canadians need a government that will stand up for them and protect them, and Conservatives will do that.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today about Bill C-381, the Protection Against Extortion Act. As we all know, extortion is increasingly impacting Canadian communities. We recognize and acknowledge that extortion is a very serious crime that can impact multiple facets of a person's life. Bill C-381 proposes amendments to the Criminal Code, which the sponsor believes will combat extortion by reinstating a mandatory minimum penalty. I will focus my remarks today on the proposed amendments related to the penalty regime and sentencing. As it currently stands, Mr. Speaker, we have a robust criminal law framework to address the crime of extortion. The offence of extortion is covered under Section 346 of the Criminal Code and is a straight indictable offence that carries significant penalties. These penalties are intended to reflect the seriousness of the offence and the responsibility of the offender. If an individual is convicted of extortion, they will be subject to the maximum penalty of imprisonment for life. I want to emphasize this. The maximum penalty for extortion is life imprisonment. Bill C-381 also proposes to direct courts to consider as an aggravating factor the fact that the offender, in committing the offence of extortion, also committed arson. We recognize that arson is a serious crime that poses a danger to a community and the public, and there is unquestionable intent to cause damage to property. While there is no doubt that the combination of extortion and arson is damaging and a dangerous one, I question whether this change will have any meaningful effect. It seems to me as if there is evidence that someone committed arson and extortion, then a prosecutor will seek convictions for both. And if they do, then the proposed aggravating factor becomes meaningless. Moreover, treating an element of an offense for which an offender was convicted as aggravating at sentencing has been found to be an error in principle in the Supreme Court case of Canada's decision in La Case 2015. Arson can have devastating impacts to individuals and businesses. As with cases of extortion, the seriousness of the offense of arson is reflected in the current criminal framework to address crimes of this nature. Individuals convicted of arson are subject to maximum terms of imprisonment ranging from 5 years to life, depending on the circumstances. Along with the offenses contained in the code, the sentencing regime addresses the seriousness of extortion and arson as it relates to organized crime. Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code sets out aggravating factors that a sentencing judge must take into consideration when crafting an appropriate sentence. One of the codified aggravating factors is evidence that the offense was committed for the benefit of, at the direction of, or in association with a criminal organization. Given that extortion crimes often imply a level of sophistication that suggests the workings of criminal enterprise, this factor gives sentencing judges the ability to impose penalties that fall on the higher end of the spectrum in cases where organized crime is involved. A court must also consider the victim's extortion when crafting an appropriate sentence. The sentencing regime sets out that it will be particularly aggravating if an offense has a significant impact on the victim, considering their age and other personal circumstances, such as their financial situation. I would also note, Mr. Speaker, that Bill C-381 proposes enacting more mandatory minimum penalties. We have had ample evidence over the years that MMPs do not work. I don't want you to take my word for it either, Mr. Speaker. Listen to Ben Perrin, legal advisor to former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He has stated that mandatory minimum penalties are a grave policy failure and cheap politics. Mr. Perrin goes on to say, quote, "If history is any judge, the Leader of the Opposition's mandatory minimum penalties may not be worth the paper they're written on. What's worse, even if they do pass constitutional muster, they will only exacerbate the existential challenges facing the criminal justice system." Mr. Perrin goes on to say, quote, "The Leader of the Opposition's idea may actually backfire, leading to more crime in the long term." And again, these aren't my words, Mr. Speaker. These are the words of the former legal advisor to Stephen Harper. This is the man who advised Stephen Harper on justice policy, who has now seen the problems caused by reckless Conservative Party criminal justice policy. Our government believes in evidence-based policy, and we know this simply isn't that. The Leader of the Opposition likes to throw around phrases like "stop the crime," but has no real plan to do that. Mr. Speaker, as we often see from him, it's just a series of slogans. We on this side actually believe in policies that will reduce crime. We also know that mandatory minimum penalties have a disproportionate effect on Black and Indigenous people in the justice system. Data from Corrections Service of Canada shows that a disproportionate impact of MMPs on Indigenous peoples and Black Canadians has also been reported in admissions to federal correctional institutions. Specifically, of all admissions to federal custody between 2007/8 to 2016/17, 39% of all Black offenders and 20% of all Indigenous offenders were admitted for an offense punishable by a mandatory minimum penalty. The proportion of Indigenous offenders admitted with an offense punishable by a mandatory minimum penalty increased from 14% in the same year of 07/08 to 26% in 16/17. The proposal brought forward by the honourable member is unlikely to result in higher sentences being imposed, given the serious penalties already associated with arson and extortion, and the corresponding aggravating factors I referenced earlier. Our existing legal framework, Mr. Speaker, provides judges with the tools and discretion needed to tailor sentences that reflect the gravity and offense of the offenses by the offender. So, Mr. Speaker, while there is no doubt that extortion is a serious crime, our current legal framework is such that extortion is being addressed in a way that reflects the severity and harmful effects. We need to focus on serious policies that will actually combat crime, rather than empty slogans and policies we know will not work. I encourage all honourable members to work together on policy that will combat crime, rather than failed slogans and policies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Le débat continue avec l'honorable député.
Continuing debate, the honourable member for Rivière-du-Nord. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Listen, it's a bit like Groundhog Day. I've been in this House since 2015, and this is a recurring debate. the Liberal and NDP vision, on the one hand, is against mandatory minimum sentences. And then on the other hand, we have the Conservatives, who would like to apply these sentences to as many offences as possible. We need to consider this question. It is anything but trivial. But we also need to try to find ways to be effective. We need to try to adopt laws and regulations that meet the values of the society we live in. The Bloc Québécois is opposed in principle to the systematic addition of minimum sentences to the criminal code. Prison sentences are often essential, and our courts do not hesitate to use this punishment to sanction many offenses. But there are other possible sanctions, other possible solutions other than prison, and they deserve to be taken into consideration. I am not saying that we should be more tolerant when an offense is committed. On the contrary, we believe that our values should be reflected in the laws we adopt, and these laws should be applied and respected by everyone. When our rules are violated, a fair and meaningful consequence should follow. But let us never forget to show imagination when we are thinking about how to design our legal system. I would invite us to dare to imagine more, to imagine better solutions. We are here to legislate, and in the Bloc Québécois, we believe that our legal system should contribute to a functional society. A system that is safe, equitable, and fair. As legislators, it is our responsibility to create laws and regulations to ensure that each citizen can move freely and safely around our cities and in our streets. It would be so wonderful if one day we could eradicate crime. Of course, it's been some time since I believed in unicorns or Santa Claus, but I will never stop working to make our society better. That's why I believe that we must continually try to help people to rehabilitate. Whenever this is possible, when people have offended and they are sentenced, we should think about rehabilitation. It's not a silver bullet. It should rather be our objective. As members of this legislature, we should find the methods that would allow us to punish those who need to be punished, prevent them from harming others, and when possible, help them to come back onto the righteous path. Last year on January 13th, the 13 provincial and territorial premiers wrote to the Prime Minister to point out his duties in this regard. They proposed reversing the burden of proof in the areas of bail in cases of possession of a banned or restricted firearm. We should, of course, take this into account and be vigilant. The question remains, Mr. Speaker, how to act effectively. The Supreme Court has already invalidated a number of mandatory minimums that had been adopted under a previous parliament. This situation had to be corrected, and a number of these mandatory minimums were abolished. But that hasn't stopped our colleagues in the Conservative Party from coming back and trying to present legislation to add these minimum sentences again to the criminal code over and over. Perhaps I might take offense to this because, like I said, in our party, we don't necessarily approve of mandatory minimums, but instead, I will take this as an invitation to work hard and consider how we can improve our system and how we can consider creating the most appropriate sanctions for offenders. At committee, I have previously proposed an alternative solution. It would be a way to reconcile the liberal NDP vision with the conservative vision at the other extreme. my solution could potentially reconcile these two opposing positions. Why not take mandatory minimums and then add a provision that would enable courts to put aside these mandatory minimums when there are exceptional circumstances? So yes, we would have our mandatory minimums that the Conservatives like so much, but we would also have a safety valve. It would enable a judge who's hearing a case to say, oh, in this particular case, the mandatory minimum just makes no sense. And so, in extenuating circumstances and in very specific cases, the tribunals could decide not to use the mandatory minimum. Is that the very best idea? Maybe not, but it's definitely an idea and one that should be considered, in my opinion. Another possibility, Mr. Speaker, why not consider modifications to sentences where there would be a transitional period at the end where the prisoner would be set free but would have to wear an electronic device that would enable authorities to find them. So, for example, in a 1 or 2 year sentence, that period could be followed by a period where the prisoner is set free and can work or engage in social and family occupations and have a quote-unquote normal life, as normal as possible, but while being constantly monitored, which means that it would be very difficult for such an individual to start their criminal occupations again with impunity. It would be very difficult because they're being monitored. A criminal organization would almost certainly not wish to use the services of an individual who's that compromising. Or if someone has a 3, 4, 5, 10-year prison sentence, we know that if they were a member of a criminal organization, we know that as soon as they get out of prison, they're almost automatically called upon by the criminal organization. And they're immediately given an errand to run. They're told, oh, go pick up this package or do some other criminal errand. But if such an individual were wearing the electronic bracelet, well, I don't think that criminal organizations would be willing to do this. Certainly not the most effective organizations. So that's another possibility. Again, I don't know if it's the very best idea. Maybe not. Maybe it is. But it's certainly worth thinking about. And so again here, with our Conservative colleagues, when they talk about mandatory minimums, I will consider that an invitation to continue working on improving the criminal code. And so the Bloc Québécois will thus vote to send C-381 to committee so we can work to ensure that it reflects our values of safety, justice, appropriate consequences for heinous actions, while all aiming for rehabilitation in the short or medium term, a better society, one composed of people who engage in honest actions and in some cases have been rehabilitated.
We have a continuing debate with the Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Saanich-Sooke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to start tonight by stating what is particularly obvious to most people, and that is that tough on crime is a slogan and not a policy that contributes to keeping communities safe. Dealing effectively with crime requires a laser focus on the reality that is before us, and exaggerating crime statistics to promote fear brings us nothing closer to solutions. And in fact, it often leads us to counterproductive measures. So I would ask everyone to beware of those who cite percentages when we're talking about crimes. It's an easy way to distort the situation we're facing. And the most basic example of that is that 2 is, of course, 100% greater than 1. And so I am not in any way saying we don't have a problem with extortion. We do. We clearly do. But to combat it, we must understand what is actually going on with extortion in this country. So last month, media reports identified 74 active investigations of extortion in 3 provinces. And what do all these investigations have in common? all the extortion cases targeted South Asian businesses, whether they're restaurants, whether they're laundries, whether they're bakeries, whether they're convenience stores. They're all owned by members of the South Asian community. All of these cases use the same methods: letters, phone calls, and social media messages threatening arson, drive-by shootings, and even kidnapping if protection money is not paid. And all of these included messages which threatened bullets rather than future messages if the police were contacted. Clearly, there's no coincidence here. This is organized crime at work targeting the South Asian community. There were incidents last November in White Rock and Abbotsford of threatening letters that gave a month to pay up. And in December, shots were fired at least one home in White Rock, 2 shootings at homes in Abbotsford, and 1 case of arson. In Ontario, Peel Regional Police opened 29 investigations in November, and like in BC, Peel Regional Police reported several shootings in which multiple shots were fired at homes and businesses. There were 34 identical incidents in Edmonton. Now, some arrests have been made, 2 in Surrey, 7 in Edmonton, and 5 in the Peel region. And the RCMP has created a task force, which they call the RCMP National Coordination and Support Team, to share information and coordinate efforts to combat what is clearly targeting the South Asian community by organized crime. This is key to combating the extortion, delivering resources to those local police forces and the RCMP to share information and to coordinate their efforts. Now, in February, in the midst of these instances in Surrey, the Conservative leader delivered a speech where he laid out the 3 things proposed in this bill: imposing a mandatory minimum of 3 years for extortion and 4 years if using a firearm, and adding arson as an aggravating circumstance. He called these additional tools for police to use. Now, here's the problem with this proposal, and the reason why the NDP will be voting against C-381. The evidence is clear that mandatory minimums are not effective as a deterrent. They are not a tool that deters people from crime. No criminals sit around at home thumbing through the criminal code to see what possible penalty they face before deciding whether to commit a crime. What they do evaluate is how certain they are to be caught and prosecuted. And so devoting resources to enforcement and devoting resources to prosecution are the keys to deterring offenses like extortion, which are clearly premeditated and planned. Now, there's another problem with this, of course, and that's the unintended consequences. And the member for Kingston clearly identified that mandatory minimums disproportionately impact those most marginalized in society, the poorest in our society, Indigenous people, and racialized people. But there's a second unintended consequence that often is missed. And I know about this by my experience as a police board member and in teaching criminal justice. If you have a mandatory minimum, then the prosecutor can't really plea bargain. And why is that important in extortion? The person who gets arrested most often in extortion investigations is the person who did the drive-by or who threw the firebar. These are most often young men who've been pressed into services by gangs. If you want to get at the organizers, the people who hired them, in effect, to carry out these crimes, you have to be able to use plea bargaining. But with a mandatory minimum where they know they're sure to go into prison, then you've got no way of getting at the people who actually organize these crimes. And so it's an unintended consequence of mandatory minimums that obstructs the investigation and prosecution of crimes like extortion. And so I won't go on at great length here because we've had to make these arguments many times. It's clear mandatory minimums don't work to deter crime. It's clear what works, and that is devotion of resources to enforcement and to prosecution. And we have to understand that in the case of extortion, the Conservatives like to situate this in some great, huge crime wave that's sweeping the country. In extortion, it is a particularly focused campaign by organized crime to target the South Asian community in this country, and we have to respond appropriately. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Continuing debate with the honourable member for Yellowhead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand today before this House to address a grave concern that has escalated into a crisis under the watch of this NDP Liberal government: extortion. A severe crime threatening the safety and security of Canadians has alarmingly surged, particularly in Alberta. we've seen a staggering 283% increase in reported cases after 8 years of this government. This epidemic of crime has sown fear across our communities, demanding a robust response that the current policies fail to provide. In recent years, our nation has witnessed a troubling escalation in extortion rates, driven by inadequate responses and lenient policies from this government. Their approach to crime, especially serious offenses like extortion, has been characterized by a disturbing leniency that has allowed criminals to thrive. Notably, the repeal of mandatory minimum sentences for extortion-related offenses under Liberal Bill C-5 has directly contributed to this increase, emboldening offenders with the knowledge that consequences will be minimal. The impact in Alberta has been particularly severe. Families and business owners face daily threats, and entire communities live in heightened anxiety. A glaring example of this government's failure to protect its citizens occurred recently in Edmonton, where a criminal network targeted the South Asian community. Home builders and construction businesses were extorted for large ransoms via threats communicated through digital platforms like WhatsApp. When their demands were not met, the criminals resorted to arson, destroying properties and livelihoods. This case is not isolated, but indicative of a broader pattern enabled by the Liberal soft-on-crime policies. This surge in extortion is mirrored nationally, with Canada's overall extortion incidents having increased fivefold over the past decade. These numbers are damning, evidence of failure of this NDP Liberal coalition's approach. Their soft-on-crime stance has not only undermined the effectiveness of our police forces, but has also eroded the trust between the Canadian public and the justice system. The promise of safety and security, a fundamental responsibility of any government, has been forsaken, leaving Canadians to bear the consequences. The consequences of this government policies extend beyond the immediate victims of extortion. They ripple across the economy, deter investment, and stifle the growth of communities, particularly those most vulnerable to such crimes. In Alberta, where the extortion rate has skyrocketed, we see a clear correlation between rising crime and a faltering community confidence. This erosion of security is a direct result of policies that prioritize criminal leniency over effective public safety. In the face of rising extortion threats and the palpable failure of this government, the Conservative Deputy Leader and Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods has taken decisive action by introducing Common Sense Bill C-381. The Protection Against Extortion Act. This legislation marks a critical shift towards restoring the rule of law and providing substantial deterrence against the crime of extortion. Bill C-381 is carefully crafted to address the complexities of extortion crimes, ensuring that penalties are both appropriate and effective. The legislation proposes to re-establish mandatory minimum sentences, which were unwisely removed by the Liberals, weakening our justice system's ability to deter serious criminal activity. Under this new law, anyone found guilty of extortion will face a minimum of 3 years in prison. This firm stance is essential to communicate that extortion will not be tolerated, and the justice system stands ready to impose significant consequences. The bill significantly addresses escalated risk involved when firearms are used in extortion. By restoring a mandatory 4-year penalty for extortion involving firearms, this bill aims to counteract the increased danger to victims and send a strong message to criminals about the seriousness of using deadly weapons in the commission of crimes. Additionally, the legislation targets the organized crime networks that often orchestrate these extortion schemes. Recognizing the sophisticated nature of these criminal enterprises, the bill sets a mandatory 5-year sentence for any act of extortion carried out for the benefit of or in association with a criminal organization. This provision is particularly crucial as it strikes at the heart of organized crime, aiming to dismantle the groups that profit from extortion activities. Also, this bill introduces arson as a recognized aggregating factor in extortion cases. This is a significant addition, reflecting the severe impact that arson has on victims and communities, often used as a tool for intimidation or retaliation. Enhancing penalties for extortion cases involving arson acknowledges the profound trauma and destruction associated with such acts and bolsters the law's response to them. The introduction of Bill C-381 comes at a critical time, where the need for fortifying our legal framework against extortion has never been more urgent. The recent rise in extortion cases, especially those involving severe tactics like arson and the use of firearms, underscores the need for legislation that can effectively respond to and curb these crimes. By implementing these targeted measures, this legislation not only aims to deter individuals and groups involved in extortion, but also to restore public confidence in the justice system's ability to protect them and ensure their safety. The differences between conservative and liberal approaches in addressing crime are stark. While the current NDP Liberal coalition has favored a soft approach that has seen penalties reduced and serious offenders quickly return to the streets, Conservatives advocate for robust measures that prioritize the safety of all Canadians. Our approach is to enforce laws that deter criminals effectively and provide real protection to our communities. As we stand here today, faced with a significant rise in violent crimes and extortion, we must choose action over inaction. The Protection Against Extortion Act is not just another piece of legislation, it is a real solution for those who have been living in fear of criminals. This bill restores necessary and effective penalties for extortion, particularly addressing the use of firearms, the involvement of organized crime, and the destructive act of arson. We can no longer stand by as our communities suffer. I urge all members of the House to support Bill C-381. It's time to send a clear message that we are committed to the safety and security of our citizens. By passing this bill, we will demonstrate that we stand for justice, security, and we stand for peace of mind that every Canadian deserves. Let's take decisive action today. Let's pass this bill, ensure that our streets are safe again. It's not just our duty, it's our responsibility to bring home safe streets